Welcome to the deep dive. This time, you've given us some really detailed material looking into something pretty fundamental to, well, how things get built, pricing construction projects.
That's right.
We're going to unpack this process of creating what are called detailed cost estimates.
Exactly. And we're moving past those, early ballpark figures we might have discussed before.
Right.
This is about the really precise numbers that come together when a project's design is pretty much finalized. It's a totally different level of accuracy.
Yeah, because it serves a specific job, doesn't it? At this stage, we're not just guessing.
Definitely not.
Your sources highlight two key functions. First, it tells the owner exactly what they're committing to, financially speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Clear commitment. And second, it lays out for the contractor what they expect to earn. It's like the financial blueprint, right?
It really is. And what's fascinating, I think, is just how much information, how much detail goes into these numbers that on the surface might seem straightforward. It's quite a systematic job.
Okay, let's dive in though. So in construction, what exactly is a detailed estimate? Your notes mention a few names for it.
Yeah, you might hear it called a bid estimate, sometimes a final estimate. The key thing is when it's done.
Okay.
It's usually put together right at the end of the design phase. So the contractors bidding on the job, they have the complete finalized design information to work from.
Gotcha. So this isn't just scribbling on a napkin. It's the full financial picture, down to the nuts and bolts.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Detailed estimates are incredibly thorough. They don't just cover the obvious things like, bricks and labor.
Right.
They account for every construction cost. Direct costs, yes, but also all the indirects, things like site supervision, maybe permits.
Okay.
And crucially, it includes costs for any subcontractors they plan to use, plus the general contractor's own overhead, their business costs, and of course, their profit.
Wow, that sounds like a massive undertaking. Where do they even begin to pull all that together?
It is a big job, definitely, but it follows a very structured kind of step-by-step method. It basically mirrors how the building will actually be constructed.
How so?
Well, the estimator starts right at the beginning, think foundations. Then they work their way up systematically through every single trade, every material, right up to the roof and the final finishes.
So it's like building the project on paper, but with dollar signs attached.
That's a great way to put it. And the first really critical step is something called the takeoff. What did you gather about that part?
Right, the takeoff from the material, it seems like that's all about measurement, really precise quantification.
Yeah.
The estimator goes through all the drawings, the specs, everything, and makes a detailed list of every single work item, basically taking off the quantities of all the materials needed.
Perfect description. Think about it. They're counting every single window, calculating the exact square footage of drywall, figuring out the number of light fixtures, the linear feet of pipes. Everything gets measured, quantified.
Okay, so they have this giant, super detailed shopping list with exact amounts. How does that turn into actual costs?
Right, that's the next step.
Right.
Pricing it all out. For every single item on that takeoff list, the costs are typically broken down into three main buckets.
Which are?
You've got the labor cost, what it costs to install it. Then the material cost, the actual price of the item itself. And finally, any equipment costs needed for that specific task.
Oh, okay.
The contractor then figures out a unit cost for each of those components for every single item.
And that must need some serious up-to-date knowledge of material prices, labor rates, all that changing stuff.
It absolutely does. And to make this clearer, your source material gives a really good example.
Right.
It walks through calculating the cost for putting up some half-inch fire-resistant gypsum board on 4 walls.
The drywall example. Yeah. Okay, let's see. So 4 partitions, right? Each one is 15 feet high, 32 feet long, and you need drywall on both sides. So you multiply that out. 15 times 32 times 2 sides times 4 walls gives you 3,840 square feet of drywall.
Exactly. So the estimator has that precise quantity. Now, they need the cost. The source mentions a couple of ways they might start figuring that out.
Yeah, it says they might look at their own past projects from, historical data.
Right, what they paid before.
Or get quotes directly from suppliers. But because this detailed estimate happens late in the design, when you have all the specifics,
Right, much more info.
the example shifts to using published cost data, specifically RS means construction cost data.
Yes, and RS means is interesting because of how it organizes everything. It uses a system called master format. What's your take on that?
Master format. Okay, that's the standard for organizing construction specs and information, right? Developed by the Construction Specifications Institute, CSI.
Exactly.
It's hierarchical, starts broad with divisions like level 1, then gets more and more specific.
Think of it like a Dewey Decimal System, but for construction elements. It brings order to the chaos.
Yeah, a really detailed table of contents.
And RS Means uses this, but takes it even further with these very specific, like 12-digit line numbers for individual cost items. How does that play out in our drywall example?
Well, the example shows Division 09 is for finishes, then 0929 is specifically gypsum board, and 092910 is even more specific, level 3.
Getting granular.
Definitely. Then you see actual line numbers like, let's see, 0929 10.30 2050. That's for standard board, taped and finished. And another one, 2200, is for water-resistant board with no finish included. It shows just how specific this data gets.
It really does. And for every one of these tiny line items, RS Means packs in a lot of info. What kind of data are we talking about?
Okay, for each line, you get things like a coded standard crew size. For our drywall, it says a crew of 2 carpenters.
Okay, 2 carp.
Right. Then the crew's typical daily output, how much they can install per day. Labor productivity, too, like how many labor hours it takes one worker for one unit. The unit itself is stated square feet, SF in our case. And then the core costs, the bare material cost per unit, the bare labor cost per unit.
Bare meaning just the raw cost, no markups yet.
Exactly. But then it also gives a total cost, which does include typical overhead and profit.
Ah, okay. So applying that to our 3,840 square feet of fire-rated drywall, what does RS Means say?
The example points to a specific line number, and the total cost, including that O&P, is $1 or 2 square foot.
Okay.
So multiply 1.02 by our 3,840 square feet, and that comes out to $3,916.80 for the drywall installation.
And you can see the components of that $1 to 2 as well, right?
Yeah. The data also shows the bare material cost is 36 cents per square foot, and the bare labor cost is 41 cents per square foot.
Got it.
But it's important, as the source notes, these are national averages.
Ah, right. Good point.
A contractor has to adjust these, for the specific city or region the project is in. Labor costs especially can vary a lot.
Makes total sense. Costs in New York versus, say, Omaha are going to be different.
Exactly.
The example also shows how to estimate the actual time it takes. How does that calculation work?
Right. So if you want to know how long that installation takes, you take the total square footage, 3,840 SF, and divide it by the daily output for that 2 carpenter crew. RS Means says that's 2,000 SF per day for this specific item.
Okay, so 3,840 divided by 2,000.
Gives you 1.92 days, which, practically speaking, you probably round up to 2 full work days for that crew.
2 days for the 2-person crew. Got it. And there's another angle on labor time, too.
Yeah, using the labor hours per unit, the data gives that, too. 1.008 labor hours per square foot for one worker.
Okay.
Multiply that by the 3,840 square feet, you get about 30.72 total labor hours for one person, which is roughly 4 8-hour workdays for one worker.
Interesting. So you can look at it by crew days or total worker hours.
Exactly. Provides different perspectives on the labor planning.
Okay, so the estimator does this incredibly detailed breakdown for literally everything in the project.
Pretty much, yeah. Every single task, every material.
Wow. So once they've done all that meticulous work, how do they braid it all together? All that data must be overwhelming.
That's where the estimate summary sheet comes in. It's the roll-up.
The big picture.
Exactly. This is where all those calculated quantities, the unit prices they've confirmed, and all the indirect project costs get compiled.
Okay. And what are the key things you'd see on that summary?
Well, obviously the totals for all the direct work broken down, but then it adds in the contractor's overhead, their general business costs, office rent, stuff like that.
Right. The cost of just being in business.
And their profit margin.
Yeah.
Plus any sales tax, usually just on materials. And then there's the labor burden.
Labor burden. Explain that a bit.
That's all the extra costs tied to labor beyond just the wage. Think payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare, workers' comp insurance, maybe benefits. It's a significant chunk.
Gotcha. So the final number on this sheet is what? The bid price.
Typically, yes. For a competitively bid job, that final number is the bid. For a fixed price contract, it's the amount the owner agrees to pay.
And if it's a cost reimbursable job?
Then the owner usually gets to see all the underlying detail, not just the final number. More transparency there.
Okay. The source mentioned the format isn't set in stone, but it uses an Excel example. What does that look like?
Yeah, the example shows how it's often organized. Using those master format divisions again helps keep things tidy.
Makes sense. Consistent structure.
Then you usually see columns breaking down the costs the general contractor, GC, handles directly so, columns for their materials, their labor, their equipment,
Okay.
and really importantly, a separate column just for subcontractor costs.
So you can see clearly what the GC is doing versus what's being subbed out.
Exactly. It makes it very clear. The example gives a couple of illustrations, concrete and masonry.
Right. Tell us about those.
Okay, so for 0300 concrete, the example shows costs listed under the GC's materials, labor, and equipment columns, but $0 in the subcontracts column,
Meaning?
meaning the GC's own crews are doing all the concrete work. The total direct cost there is $147,663.
Okay, all GC work and masonry.
For 0400 masonry, it's the opposite. Zeros under the GC's material, labor, equipment. But there's $56,400 listed in the subcontracts column.
So all the masonry is being handled by a subcontractor.
Precisely. And the total cost for each line item, like concrete or masonry, is just the sum across that row.
Got it. What else gets added on the summary sheet after these direct and subcontract costs?
Okay, after you total up all those different work scopes, you add in the indirect project costs, things like maybe temporary utilities, site security, project management, staff time.
The general conditions stuff.
Right. Then comes sales tax. The example uses 7.75%, and that's typically applied only to the total material costs.
Okay, just materials.
And then the payroll tax or labor burden. The example uses 36% applied to the total labor costs. And remember, that total labor cost includes the wages plus this burden. It adds up quickly.
36% is quite a bit on top of wages.
It can be, yeah. Varies by location and company, but it's significant.
Okay, so direct costs, indirects, taxes, labor burden. Then comes the GC's own costs and profit.
Exactly. The summary adds a line for the contractor's general business overhead. The example calculates this as 5% of the total direct costs.
Okay.
And finally, profit. That's what the contractor hopes to have left after all expenses are paid. It can be a fixed amount or a percentage. Here, it's 3.5% of the costs leading up to it.
Only 3.5% seems kind of low. What influences that percentage?
Good question. The source mentions a few things. Project risk is a big one.
More risk, potentially more profit needed.
Generally, yeah. Also, how much work the contractor already has. If they're busy, maybe they don't need to bid as low.
Supply and demand.
Kind of. And how competitive the market is. Lots of bidders might drive profit margins down. And interestingly, bigger jobs sometimes have lower profit percentages, even though the dollar amount is higher.
Huh. Okay. So after adding all that up, direct, indirect, tax, burden, overhead, profit, what's the final number in the example?
The bottom line, the total project cost or bid price comes out to $1,795,979.
Just shy of $1.8 million. That's built up from a lot of tiny details.
It really is. And this detailed estimate, it's obviously vital for getting the job and setting the budget. But your sources say it then becomes a key management tool during construction, the cost baseline.
That's right. Once the contract is signed, that detailed bid estimate is used to create the cost baseline. It's not just the costs, though.
What else?
It links those costs directly to a detailed project schedule, so you know when you expect to spend the money for each activity.
Ah, okay, so it's a time-phased budget.
Exactly, and it becomes the benchmark. All the actual costs spent during construction get compared against this baseline.
So it's for tracking financial health in real time.
Precisely. It lets the project team track, monitor, evaluate, and hopefully control the project's costs as they happen.
And if things go off track, if actual costs are higher than the baseline.
That's a variance.
Yeah.
The team investigates why it happened. Maybe materials cost more, maybe labor took longer, and then they take corrective action to try to get back on budget.
Is that baseline set in stone once the project starts?
Mostly, yes. It's the primary target. But it can be formally revised under certain conditions.
Like?
Well, if the scope of the project changes, if the owner adds work through a change order, for instance.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or if there are major unforeseen issues like discovering unexpected ground conditions that significantly impact cost or schedule, then a revised baseline might be needed to reflect the new reality.
Got it. It really shows how that initial estimate isn't just a price tag. It lives on through the whole project.
It absolutely does. It underpins financial control from bid day to final completion.
It really highlights that putting together an accurate construction estimate isn't just, number crunching. It's this incredibly detailed, systematic process.
Yeah, and it's crucial. Essential for financial planning, essential for managing the project effectively.
Definitely.
So next time you see a construction site, new building going up, or even just a renovation,
Yeah.
think about the immense detail, the sheer effort that went into figuring out that initial cost. That number acts as such a critical benchmark, influencing decisions and shaping the financial journey of that project, big or small, right from the very start.